What's up, guys? This is Chris from Mitten Mobile Hunting. In this video, I'm going to be doing a tutorial or lesson, so to speak, on how I use OnX most effectively. I know there's a ton of videos out there on OnX for different states and different areas. You know, a lot of people use it for private and what have you, but the way that I like to use it with all the state land around me is I like to use all the different tools that are built into there. So if you don't have OnX, or if you just not sure how to use it, in this video I'll break down the tools that are built into OnX that I use to key in on certain areas on the state land in my area. With that being said, I'm going to just pick a random chunk of state land I found in Michigan. That way I'm not obviously giving away my stand locations, and if you happen to hunt in this specific area, I do sincerely apologize. I'm just picking a random chunk of state land that is big enough with the sort of terrain and sort of things that I'm looking for to kind of paint the best picture of the way that I use OnX most effectively to, again, key in on hot spots, hot areas, and have a plan before I go out into the woods. Because doing the research on the maps, I find, is the most effective way to come up with at least a rough idea of what looks good before you actually go there. Because there's nothing more annoying than just driving to a state land or driving to a property you've never been in before and you've got no clue where to go. You got thousands of acres ahead of you with no sort of sense of direction. And I think that, again, OnX is a very, very useful tool that I think more people, if you are trying to get better at identifying land features and identifying areas to go in, I think it's a tool that more people should use and use it to their most advantage that they can. So I'm about to jump into it and share my screen and kind of go through all the layers and tools. And obviously there's more to it that I will go into later on in the season when you're actually boots on the ground and in the area. But at least this sort of video will focus in on sort of like pre-trip scouting, trying to, you know, if you have a 5, 10, 15,000 acre chunk of state land, it can get very overwhelming and kind of feeling like throwing darts at a dartboard when you're looking at the whole map. It's very overwhelming to try to find the best spots before you go. And if you're like me, you don't have tons of time and days on days to walk around and actually boots on the ground find the best spots. Especially if, again, I have an hour and a half drive to 2 hour drive from to where I want to go and where I want to hunt. And if you experience that as well, you're not going to want to drive up and down and up and down and up and down and spend all that time in the woods trying to find the best spots. It'll help you if you kind of have maybe a top 3, top 5 picked out before you go. So let me switch over and share my screen and I will kind of dive into it further. Okay, so this is my, again, just random chunk of state land that I picked that has some similar features and or really a good diverse set of features in the area. And again, if you hunt here, forgive me, you know that there's tons of state land out there, and I'm really just kind of going over features on OnX more so than, you know, this specific chunk of land. I do not hunt here, never hunted here in my life. I just, again, picked a random area. So first and foremost, I like to obviously have the government lands turned on or the state lands turned on so I know, you know, where I can hunt legally and that's not private land. So that's what this sort of light green or dark green, you see this different shading here, all this, these boxes. Obviously this is not like a big chunk where it's like one perfect square. A lot of state land in Michigan, it's broken up into different sections that the government has acquired throughout the years or however that works. So this sort of chunk has all different features surrounded by private, and you know, it looks like there's quite a few different access points that maybe you can get into, which that kind of leads me to my first point is obviously a lot of chunks of land you can't just walk into from any direction. You have to start with parking lots. You know, you have to find where you can actually park and access and then walk in from there. So that is kind of the first thing to kind of key on before I do anything else. You know, so in this specific chunk, looks like a lot of it is locked by private. So I would like to assume that looks like there's a road here, that night road. Looks like there's another road bisecting here. So looks like I could go in from the southwest here or from the northwest there. Looks like you probably have access all throughout that Tyler Plains Road right there. So that's kind of the first step that I like to do, is find out where I can actually park and access. And from there, I want to get as far in as I can, or at least as deep away from the parking lots as I can, because most guys don't go more than a half mile due to whatever reason they have, obviously. So next thing I like to do to find the hot spots, or the spots that I like to key in on, is I will go into this trees, crops, and soil area, and I like to turn on the U.S. crop distribution. Now that will identify all the historical data as far as what's been planted there, and you know what you can find in the surrounding areas. Now obviously that's mostly going to be on private land. You know, there's very, very rarely crops on state land, but I have seen OnX identify some of it as winter wheat and other sort of food sources. But I like to turn that on because a lot of the deer, depending on the time of year, will be either early morning leaving those food plots or farm fields, and in the late afternoon they'll be going to those farm fields. So that's always kind of nice during the high pressured times to see, you know, what sort of food sources are around that the deer may be utilizing and leaving or going to. So with that being said, it looks like this specific chunk of land doesn't necessarily have a ton of crop distribution close by. So this area might be a little bit tougher to use that to your advantage, or at least use this specific layer to your advantage. For instance, let's just poke around and see what this one is. So you can actually click on the colored areas that pop up, and it'll show you, if you scroll down. Let me get this opened up more. So apparently, according to OnX, right there under crop data, it says soybeans. So maybe historically or inaccurately picked on by the map or by OnX's features, it'll say that that's a soybean field. Now that's something that I would like to actually boots on the ground find out for sure, you know, whether that is a field. But most of the times, if it's on state land, it's probably not an active farm field, or it's not actively growing anything, or at least definitely not soybeans. So let me back up here and go to the next sort of layer that I like to use. So after I turn on the crop distribution, I like to turn on wetlands, which in Michigan, that's a lot of area. You know, Michigan's got tons of swamp area, and when I turn that feature on in this chunk of state land, looks like it follows a river system, which you can actually see right here. Plains Creek, it shows up. So all that dark purpley blue, that's all going to be wetlands, which it's super nice to know, again, before you're going in. So if you wanted to hunt a specific area, you know, you might change what boots you wear. You might want to bring in waders, you know, that, and it's just nice to know how much of the surrounding area is going to be wetland versus hardwood forest. Next thing I'd like to turn on is the acorn-producing oaks, because as many of you may know, deer love acorns depending on the time of the year. Now, one thing that I've learned is obviously white oaks are super popular, red oaks are super popular, but depending on the time of year, certain oak trees in the area have a much higher level of tannins in the acorns. Now, some of the acorns have to sit on the ground and release those tannins naturally over time before the deer can eat them. So that would be something nice to, once you're actually getting boots on the ground and getting into the woods, to figure out what kind of oak trees those are. That way you know whether it's going to be an early season food source, a late season food source, and if the acorns are actually dropping or not. Because, certain years the acorn production is pretty minimal depending on what forest you're in and what kind of oak tree it is. Another feature I like to use is the thermal deer cover, although a lot of times the thermal deer cover is pretty similar to the wetland areas. A lot of times it's the same thing. The deer will be using the wetland areas, the thermal deer cover areas. They will be using that oftentimes to get away from hunters, because that's where the least pressure is. A, because that's where the least amount of hunters are. B, that's where it's the thickest, the swampiest, the most secluded, where the deer actually feel safe. So that is another important feature that I like to key in on. And really, for my purposes, I don't really key in on any of the rest of those as far as those layers. I also like to, depending on what I'm looking for, let's see. Let me find it on here. I want to find the slope, angle, and aspect. So a lot of the Michigan area that I hunt, and a lot of Michigan in general, it's not very hilly. There's not a lot of change in elevation. So turning that feature on, the slope, angle, and aspect, that's really the easiest way to tell where you have kind of some different elevation changes. Now, a topographical map does show that, but sometimes it's just lines. You can't really tell up or down, and this feature, this slope, angle, and aspect feature, really gives you a nice visual, a color visual. That's what that green popped on. So let me watch. I'll turn it off, turn it back on. So when you turn it back on, that's all that light green that pops up. And that is nice because oftentimes you will see it follows creek bottoms, and it follows sort of natural ridges that you may not be able to identify until you actually get there. So a lot of times this will line up with pathways and runways that the deer like to use, because they like to use the path of least resistance historically. They're not going to be going through the thickest of the thick all the time. I oftentimes find deer following these same sort of slopes. So when I'm looking at this chunk of state land here, I'm going to key in on travel corridors, drainage ditches, creeks, and I want to go far away from where the parking lots are. So with all these features turned on, and I actually sometimes I like to turn off the wetland areas, because sometimes the wetland and the thermal cover kind of muddy up my map a bit. So sometimes I'll turn that off and turn off the thermal deer cover, because sometimes it's just too much. So I will be looking for elevation changes and drainage ditches when I'm keying in on state land, because what I have found is a lot of the other state land hunters, they're hunting fields, they're hunting acorns, they're hunting the big flat open areas that they can see for quite a ways, because that's just what I feel like that's where I see the most hunters when I'm out in the state land. So for my personal interest, I want to get deep into the thick stuff. I want to find natural choke points and pinch points and travel corridors that are based off the geography around it. So I have found in my own past hunting experiences, deer will hide down in the thick cedar swamps where no people are, and they will skirt the cedar swamps and use that as like a highway, and then every so often it'll pop up into the more open areas and the more flat sort of high ground oaky, tag alders, what have you. So if I'm looking at this chunk of state land, obviously you see there's some open fields here and there, and instead of just, it's hard to tell when you're looking at OnX and just looking at all these green trees. It's hard to tell what's what. It's hard to tell, like, okay, what's going to be good in this area. So with the use of OnX, it helps me kind of pinpoint. So it helps me pinpoint primary areas of focus. So I have a much narrowed down selection when I actually show up. It's a lot less overwhelming as far as, oh my God, look at this huge chunk of acreage. Where do I go? Where do I hunt? Where do I set up? So if you do this before you go, it'll help you identify. So I see a lot of elevation changes around this Plains Creek. So me personally, going in from this northwest corner over here, that might be, I guess, the most populated with hunters. A lot of guys are probably going to park there, walk southeast, and you can actually see from this map, you see there's trails. So those are probably very active, very used trails. So that might not be the area that I want to focus in on. Now, how many people do you think are going to be diving into this creek and following this creek? Like if you zoom in pretty far, you can see a pretty thick set of trees right there, and there's actually a natural boundary between them, so you can actually see the two different types of forests that are happening here based off the cluster of trees. It's very condensed and packed in trees there, and according to OnX, that's a good chunk of acorn producing oaks, followed by a little bit more open area. And I have found the deer will travel right along that east-west line, and they will use that corridor, especially then you see that it has this green, this lighter green. That's an elevation change that OnX has pinpointed out following this Plains Creek. So that's probably going to be an open marshy creek bottom with a hardwood forest a little bit higher up for bedding, food, and what have you. So that would be a really good area to key in on when I actually go scouting. So I would like to, let's drop a pin and put potential travel corridor. If I could spell corridor. There we go. Forgive me, I'm not an English major. All right. So I would drop that pin in there, and that would be sort of an area that I would want to key in on going forward if I actually would show up there. Now, again, it looks like there's a road or a trail of some sort going in here. Now, you don't know which guys are where. Now, that would be something that you would have to find out when you go. But I would actually go there and go check that out. That would be a hot spot that I want to check out because, again, looking at the whole big picture, there's a lot going on here. So how do you pick an area to go? Another area that I would like to go and key in on, so it looks like this Plains Creek, this creek bottom, looks like it has the branch off there and this marshy bottom. A nice area to go would find this intersection where this Plains Creek sort of splits off in this fork, and I would walk this transition line between whatever kind of trees are here and that creek bottom, because the deer may only be crossing this creek at every so often. So that would be a good feature to sort of use to your advantage to not only get in and get out quietly, but I would walk along that edge of the tree line and find the runways going in and out of that thick sort of again, not being there at boots on the ground, you're not sure what it looks like, but obviously you can tell it's pretty thick up in there, and then it falls off into a nice sort of open creek bottom. So forgive me if I'm just at this point rambling on and on. You know, the main features that I would like to sort of share with everybody that are useful is looking at the crop, looking at the acorns, looking at the visual elevation changes. You can drop pins, and I like to do this for multiple different areas. You know, when I'm looking at a big chunk of 10,000 acres in state land, last year, my own personal experience, you know, I did this exact thing, and I picked up, or I picked out like maybe 5 or 10 good looking areas that I wanted to focus on before I actually got there. And when I got there, there was other hunters. So it gives you a good fallback. So when you show up, you're not like, oh crap, what do I do? Where do I go? Am I going to screw up these guys when I walk past them? Or cause you don't know where they are. So it gives you multiple different areas that you can key in on by looking at all these features, so that way you know when you get out there you have fallbacks. And again, that way you're not overwhelmed and spending a ton of time scouting. So I like to use OnX to pick out maybe 5 to 10 very good potential areas to key in on when I go do my scouting mission. Now, I know, again, there's going to be better videos out there for this. And in my experience in Michigan, there's not a ton of hills, not a ton of drainage ditches that bucks will follow, you know, so you have to kind of work with what you got. There's not a lot of elevation changes. So when you're looking at just a big chunk of green, it's nice to have these features to help you narrow down where you want to look when you actually get there. So I'm going to cut it there. I can dive a little bit more into this if you guys would like, and kind of show you a little bit better of a strategy that I use. You know, picking this random chunk of land, it's kind of tough, you know. So forgive me for the rambling and the kind of broken up description here. For the main point of what I want to use is, or the main point I want to get across is using these layers to your advantage. You know, using the acorn producing oaks, using the crop distribution, using the wetland and the thermal cover, using the elevation changes, and kind of combine all those so you kind of have a much narrowed down list before you go out into the woods. That way it'll help you be more efficient and find areas faster, and that way you're not just getting way overwhelmed with what's ahead of you and not knowing where to go, and potentially wasting your time in an area when there's better areas out there. So I know this is rough. I apologize. But again, my name's Chris. This is Mitten Mobile Hunting. If you haven't already, hit like, hit subscribe, hit share, and bear with me. I hope to make much better videos and much more specific content as time goes on. This isn't going to be the last of my OnX Hunt Map sort of tutorial. I plan on doing more as the season goes, and actually showing you what to do with waypoints. You know, you can actually set stand locations, set optimal wind. So if you have, once you're actually boots on the ground, you can actually set multiple different locations and use those to your advantage, and use it for scouting and tracking. And again, there's another video to come, so bear with me, guys. Chris from Mint Mobile Hunting. I'll see you guys in the woods.